when two arrogant officers wrongfully arrest a poised black woman outside her home. They think it's just another routine power trip, but when they walk into court days later, they freeze in shock because the woman in the robe behind the bench is the same one they cuffed on the sun cast golden streaks over the quiet neighborhood of Hawthorne Grove as Cassandra Ellison adjusted the sleeves of her blazer and stepped out of her townhouse, briefcase in hand and heels clicking against the brick-lined path. A respected figure in the city's legal system, she was known for her brilliant mind, sharp wit, and unshakable calm under pressure. That morning, however, was just another Tuesday for her until two patrol officers rolled up in their cruiser, eyes narrowing suspiciously as she walked toward her car. Officer Rick Dalton, a tall, square-jawed man with a buzz-cut and mirrored sunglasses, gave his partner a knowing nod as he threw open the car door. "Hey," he barked, striding toward her. "What are you doing here?" Cassandra turned slowly, brows raised, heart steady. "Excuse me," she asked, pausing beside her Lexus. "This is my home." But the officers weren't listening. Officer Mike Saunders, younger and eager to impress, flanked Dalton as they closed in. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. Mind showing some ID?" Dalton demanded, a hand hovering near his holster. Cassandra, now fully facing them, tilted her head. "Suspicious activity. I've lived here for over 12 years. I'm on my way to court. I don't have time for games." She reached into her purse, carefully retrieving her wallet. But the moment her hand moved, both officers stiffened. "Hands where I can see them," Dalton shouted, pulling his weapon halfway out of the holster. Cassandra froze, lips parting in disbelief. "Are you serious right now?" she asked, her voice controlled but incredulous. The tension escalated as neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispers and camera phones beginning to stir. Sanders stepped forward, grabbing her wrist and wrenching the wallet from her grasp. "Stop resisting," he snapped, though she hadn't moved an inch. Cassandra didn't resist. She didn't argue. She simply stared, eyes steady, unblinking as Dalton slapped on the cuffs with unnecessary force, twisting her arm behind her back. "You're under arrest for obstruction and failure to comply with a lawful order," Dalton announced, as though he were issuing judgment from a throne. "You have the right to remain silent." The Miranda rights echoed through the cul-de-sac like a warning shot. A neighbor, Mrs. Gilmore, an elderly white woman who often brought Cassandra banana bread, gasped audibly. "That's Judge Ellison," she exclaimed to no one in particular, her hands trembling, but the officers didn't hear or didn't care. They shoved Cassandra into the back of the cruiser, ignoring her calm explanations and the neighbors' outcries at the precinct. She was fingerprinted, booked, and placed in a holding cell for nearly 6 hours. During that time, she remained poised, her silence louder than any outburst. The desk sergeant raised an eyebrow when he saw her name. "Judge Cassandra Ellison," he muttered under his breath, eyes darting toward the holding area. "You mean the Judge Ellison?" But protocol kept him from intervening, and Dalton and Sanders, smug and satisfied, filed their report with blatant exaggerations and omissions. They mocked her in the break room, laughing about putting another one in her place and making jokes about affirmative action hires. They had no idea the storm they had just summoned. When Cassandra was finally released without apology, without explanation, she walked out of the precinct with her head held high and went straight to her chambers to prepare for court the next day. She didn't call the press. She didn't file a complaint. She simply waited. And when the misconduct report she had quietly filed days earlier was reviewed by the oversight committee, who were very familiar with her fair but fearless reputation, the wheels of justice began to turn. Officer Dalton and Officer Sanders were summoned to a disciplinary hearing scheduled before the Ethics Review Board, which, due to a backlog, was to be held within the courthouse under the supervision of a rotating group of judges. As fate would have it, the rotation brought a name neither officer noticed until they stepped into the grand courtroom with its polished oak benches and towering ceilings. They swaggered in with the same arrogance, unaware that the judge presiding over their case had just walked in through the side entrance in her black robe, heels clicking softly. The bailiff called the session to order. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Cassandra Ellison." The word sliced through the room like a lightning bolt. Dalton turned, confused, as Sanders's smirk faded. Their eyes widened in unison when they saw her ascend the bench, composed, regal, and unshakably calm. Cassandra looked down at them, her gaze the same as it had been that morning, and blinking and steady. "You may be seated," she said smoothly. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. The officers exchanged a glance, their bravado crumbling as the reality set in. They hadn't arrested a random black woman outside her home. They had arrested one of the city's most respected judges, and now she held their fate in her hands. What followed would be a lesson neither man would ever forget. But for now, they sat motionless, unsure whether to speak, breathe, or pray. Judge Ellison opened the folder before her, eyes scanning the misconduct allegations. "Let the record show," she began, her voice clear, "that the court is now in session." Justice, it seemed, had just taken her seat. The courtroom held its breath, the heavy silence pressing down like a thundercloud on everyone present except for Judge Cassandra Ellison, who sat poised behind the bench, the picture of controlled power. Her black robe draped neatly over her shoulders, her gavel within arm's reach, and the file of complaints against officers Dalton and Sanders spread before her like a map of their own undoing. Neither man dared speak. Dalton's jaw flexed visibly, his earlier swagger gone, replaced by a dawning panic. Sanders' cheeks flushed, and eyes darting between the judge and the bailiff, looked like he was about to be sick. The irony, the brutal, biting irony, was that in their attempt to humiliate a black woman who dared look them in the eye, they had ended up in front of her, powerless, exposed, and about to face the consequences of their actions. "Before we begin," Judge Ellison said, her voice cool and deliberate, "let me remind you that this hearing is being recorded and reviewed by the Judicial Oversight Committee. The facts will be weighed, the conduct will be examined, and I, as presiding judge, will ensure that the law is upheld impartially and thoroughly." She allowed the silence to hang for a moment before continuing. "You may speak freely, officers, but I suggest you choose your words with care." The prosecutor, a young Latina named Maritza Gomez, rose from her table, nodding respectfully to the judge before launching into her opening remarks. "This case isn't just about misconduct, Your Honor," she began, addressing the courtroom. "It's about systemic abuse of power, racial profiling, and a culture of impunity that continues to endanger our communities. Officers Dalton and Sanders made a choice the morning they arrested Judge Ellison. They didn't follow a credible lead. They didn't respond to a call. They saw a successful black woman outside her own home, and instead of protecting her, they presumed she was a threat. They humiliated her, restrained her without cause, and fabricated charges to justify it. That cannot go unchallenged." The audience, composed of civil rights attorneys, court reporters, and members of the oversight board, nodded solemnly. Dalton shifted in his seat, visibly sweating now. His attorney, a gruff gray-haired man named Lowell Jenkins, stood next. "Your Honor," he said, "with all due respect, this hearing is already tainted. You are the victim and the judge. This is a conflict of interest." Cassandra met his gaze evenly. "That concern has already been reviewed and dismissed by the committee. This is a preliminary disciplinary hearing, not a criminal trial. I am well within judicial bounds, and my impartiality will remain intact. Continue." Jenkins sat down, defeated before he even began. The prosecution proceeded to present a devastating case. Surveillance footage from the street cameras showed Cassandra walking peacefully to her car, no sign of suspicious behavior. Audio captured from the officer's body cam submitted reluctantly by the department after Judge Ellison filed her official complaint revealed a series of racially charged comments made by Dalton before and during the arrest. "She's probably casing the place. You know how they are, always up to something." Dalton's voice sneered. "Let's check her out." Then came Sanders's voice. "Think she's got a warrant or two?" The room grew colder with every playback. When the video showed Cassandra calmly explaining she was a judge, only to be ignored and manhandled, murmurs of outrage rippled through the room. It wasn't just an overstep. It was blatant racism, deliberate abuse, and both men knew it. The defense tried to argue that Cassandra had been uncooperative and escalated the situation, but the footage contradicted every claim. She was polite, composed, and fully compliant, Gomez countered. The only escalation came from the officers who saw a black woman in an affluent neighborhood and immediately assumed criminal intent. Cassandra listened quietly, her expression unreadable. But inside, a fire burned, not for revenge but for justice. She had spent her entire career fighting to reform the system from within, believing that fairness could prevail even when the odds were stacked. This was personal, but it was also symbolic, a statement to every marginalized person who'd ever been silenced, arrested, or profiled. We are not invisible, we are not powerless. When the prosecution rested, Judge Ellison turned to the defense. "Do the officers have anything to say for themselves?" Dalton stood slowly, avoiding her eyes. "Your Honor, I didn't know who you were. If I had known, I never would have stopped." Cassandra interrupted, her tone icy. "That is precisely the problem. You thought I was just another blackface. And in your mind, that made me a suspect." She turned to Sanders. "Do you feel the same?" Sanders looked down at his shoes. "I was following orders." "No," she corrected him. "You were following bias." She leaned forward slightly, hands folded. "I've spent years advocating for better training, more accountability, more compassion in our policing system, and every time I've pushed for change, I've been told that a few bad apples shouldn't define the force. But how many bad apples are too many before the whole orchard is rotting?" Neither man answered. "They couldn't," Cassandra then addressed the room. "This hearing is not about vengeance. It's about accountability, about confronting uncomfortable truths, about ensuring that no person, no matter their badge, their title, or their skin colors, above the law or beneath its protection." She banged the gavel once. "This hearing will recess until tomorrow, where final recommendations will be made to the Oversight Committee." As she stood and exited the courtroom, the silence was no longer stunned, it was reverent. Outside, the story had already begun to spread. Local reporters had caught wind of the hearing and now stood in clusters outside the courthouse steps. Camera crews, activists, and legal experts debated the implications. And hashtags began trending online. Hashtag Judge Ellison, hashtag cuffed by racism, hashtag justice is black too. Cassandra exited through a side door to avoid the frenzy. Her phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, allies, and strangers. Some were furious, others inspired. That evening, she sat in her home, no longer the place of humiliation, but now a fortress of dignitarian, reflected on the cost of silence. Her decision had not been easy. She knew the scrutiny would be harsh, but she also knew this wasn't just about her. This was about generations of injustice. About every black girl who dreamed of becoming a judge and needed to know it was possible even in the face of hate. Even in handcuffs. Especially then. Meanwhile, at the precinct, officers Dalton and Sanders were summoned by the Internal Affairs Division and placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the review. Their colleagues whispered behind closed doors. The chief, once a staunch supporter of both men, now refused to make eye contact. The department was scrambling for damage control, but the city had seen too much. The public wasn't interested in apologies, they wanted reform. At home, Sanders fought with his wife, who had warned him about his temper and his arrogance. Dalton, alone in his apartment, stared at the news coverage, replaying the footage of his arrest. Unable to reconcile the man in the video with the one he claimed to be, he began to realize, slowly, painfully, that what he'd dismissed as just doing his job was actually a lifetime of unchecked bias exploding in one irredeemable moment. But it was too late for regrets. Tomorrow, they would return to the courtroom, not as enforcers of the law but as its defendants, and Judge Cassandra Ellison would be waiting, calm, clear-eyed, and ready to make history. The next morning dawned with a heavy tension that clung to the city like fog, thick, uncertain, impossible to ignore. Courtroom 6B was already packed before 9 a.m., the gallery full of journalists, civil rights leaders, law students, officers, and community members who'd never stepped foot in a courtroom before but now found themselves leaning forward in their seats, waiting for the final chapter in a story that had caught fire nationwide. The double doors opened, and Judge Cassandra Ellison entered with her usual composure, robes flowing behind her like the cloak of justice itself. She took her seat behind the elevated bench, the embodiment of calm authority. The bailiff called the room to order, and everyone rose, but all eyes were on her, on the woman who had once been forced into handcuffs on her own driveway, and now held a gavel in the same hands that had been restrained by leather and steel. "Please be seated," she said, her voice steady but resonating with quiet strength. The hearing resumed, and immediately the air buzzed with anticipation as both Dalton and Sanders were called to the stand one final time. They walked with the stiffness of men walking towards something irreversible because they were gone were the smirks, the swagger, the sense of untouchable power. Their uniforms had been replaced with suits, but they still couldn't hide their discomfort, their regret, and in Sanders's case, a raw and unfiltered shame. Cassandra watched them carefully, not to gloat but to study, to understand whether they had finally realized the weight of what they had done, not just to her, but to the institution they were sworn to protect. Prosecutor Gomez rose first, delivering a closing statement that seared through the courtroom like a lightning strike. What happened to Judge Ellison was not a mistake. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate misuse of power rooted in bias and arrogance. The body cam footage proves that. The false reports prove that. And their lack of remorse, until they were forced into this room, proves that. This is not about punishing individuals. This is about sending a message to every department, every officer, and every citizen. Justice is not blind to color, but it must never be blind to truth. She sat down to a quiet wave of nods from the audience. Then the defense made one last attempt to salvage what remained. "Your Honor," Attorney Jenkins said wearily, "my clients made a mistake. An ugly one, yes, but one that should be corrected with training, not termination. They have served the department for years. This hearing has already cost them their reputations. Let's not destroy their lives entirely." Cassandra remained still for a moment, then leaned forward, her eyes sharp and direct. "Counsel, with all due respect, I was arrested in broad daylight in front of my home, humiliated, manhandled, and falsely accused. Not because I broke the law, but because I fit a profile in your clients' minds. If I had not been a judge, if I had not had access to the tools to fight back, I could have lost my career, or worse." She turned to Dalton. "You filed a false report to cover up your mistake." Then to Sanders. "You ignored the truth even when I stated it plainly. I was not your enemy, but you treated me as one, and that reveals something deeply broken in the way you wield your authority." She let that linger. No one spoke. No one moved. Then she continued, her voice firm. "This court recommends that both officers Dalton and Sanders be terminated from the police department, effective immediately, with a permanent mark of misconduct on their record. Furthermore, I am submitting this case to the district attorney's office to consider criminal charges for false arrest and official misconduct. Whether or not a trial follows will be their decision." but the people deserve to know that no one, especially not those sworn to protect her, above accountability. A gasp echoed across the courtroom. Dalton closed his eyes. Sanders's shoulders slumped. The recommendation wasn't just a professional death sentence, it was a message to every officer watching. Cassandra picked up her gavel, pausing before striking. "Let it be known," she said clearly, "that justice does not bow to bias. It rises above it." The gavel fell, echoing like thunder through the chamber. Outside, the crowd had doubled, television crews battling for angles, signs held high in the air. "Justice for Ellison. Black women deserve respect. End profiling now." Cassandra emerged from the courthouse to a wall of applause. She did not smile. For the cameras, she did not wave. She simply walked upright, unapologetic, and resolute. Later that day, the police department released a statement acknowledging the decision, stating they would review internal protocols and training standards, but the public was unmoved. The city council launched an emergency session to address citizen concerns about systemic racism in law enforcement. Cassandra, though not required to attend, was invited to speak. She did, calmly, fiercely, with the precision of a woman who had spent her entire life navigating courtrooms designed to doubt her. "This isn't about me," she told the council and the cameras. "This is about the countless others who weren't judges, who didn't get hearings, who got convictions instead of closure." Her words went viral within hours. Civil rights leaders from across the country praised her restraint, her courage, and her commitment to the law. School teachers used her story in classrooms. Law professors played the footage in lectures. Cassandra Ellison had become more than a judge. She had become a symbol. But with that symbolism came pressure, attention, and, inevitably, danger. Anonymous threats arrived in her inbox. Hate mail showed up at the courthouse. Some officers who had once respected her now looked away when she walked the halls. But she refused to cower. Her integrity wasn't up for compromise. One evening, sitting on her porch as the sky turned orange with the setting sun, her neighbor Mrs. Gilmore brought over a slice of lemon pound cake. "You're the bravest person I know," the older woman whispered, her hands trembling as she handed over the plate. Cassandra smiled softly. "I just told the truth," she replied, "and I didn't let them silence me." That night, as citywide protests gave way to reforms, new body cam regulations, mandatory anti-bias training, independent oversight commissions, Cassandra finally felt something close to peace. Not because everything had changed, but because the silence had been broken. The system, flawed as it was, had been forced to look at itself through a mirror it could not shatter, and the reflection was undeniable. In the weeks that followed, Dalton and Sanders tried to appeal their termination. Both appeals were denied. The district attorney launched a formal investigation, and while no criminal charges were ultimately filed, their reputations were beyond repair. No department in the state would hire them. They became cautionary tales in law enforcement seminars. Meanwhile, Cassandra continued to preside over cases with the same grace and fairness she always had, but now, when she walked into a courtroom, the silence wasn't just out of respect, it was reverence. Because she had faced the very abuse her bench was designed to prevent, and instead of crumbling, she stood taller. In time, she was nominated for a federal judgeship, and when she walked into the Senate hearing, flanked by legal scholars and community leaders, the story followed her not as a scandal, but as a badge of honor, a record of strength, and proof that the law, when held in the right hands, could still serve the people, especially the ones it too often forgot. Cassandra Ellison never sought fame, she sought fairness, and in a world that tried to reduce her to a stereotype, she became a standard, one that the system would never again be able to ignore.